Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Jim Magagna. He is the Executive Vice President of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Can you just tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement within the cattle industry?
Well, actually, my direct involvement in the cattle industry has been just the last 22 years now that I've been the Executive Vice President of the Wyoming Stock Growers. But I have a ranch in western Wyoming, and my entire ranching career, which has been most of my life, has been with sheep. I obviously have neighbors with cattle and have some cattle that I bring in on my place a little bit, but my focus has always been the sheep industry, and my background was serving in the sheep industry. I served as president of the Wyoming Wool Growers and the American Sheep Industry Association and the Public Lands Council, all of those groups, which, of course, Public Lands Council, sheep and cattle. But as far as being directly focused on the cattle industry, that started when I came here.
What do you feel are the major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets today?
Oh, just to make it very simple, and I should say before I answer you, as you already know from what I just said, I don't deal in the cattle markets, and frankly, in my position here until this year, most of our focus has been on resource issues. So at the state level, we've not been heavily engaged in the market issues. Obviously, we've had some engagement, but so the past 6 months have been a learning experience for me. Having said that, based on what I see and discussions I've had with our members, I would say that clearly transparency is an issue. And then, at least for us in Wyoming, and we don't have a lot of finished cattle. We've only got a couple of feedlots. Most of ours are cow-calf operations and yearling operations. But to the extent that we can market finished cattle or cattle for slaughter, just a lack of options, a lack of competition in the marketplace. And those would be the two issues I would define, transparency and competition.
How do you feel we create more competition within our cattle markets?
Well, one of the things that we're heavily focused on right now at Stock Growers is trying to get some smaller but mid-sized processing facilities right here in Wyoming. We feel that we've got an opportunity to help our producers by being able to market a product right to consumers, both interstate and even globally, that's a Wyoming beef. And we're not able to do that because all we have in the state today are a number of very small processing plants that process locally. They're overwhelmed. A producer who wants to get a steer processed for their own use has to have an appointment often 8 or 9 months in advance. And so our focus has been heavily here on trying to incentivize getting some mid-sized type processing in Wyoming, not only to meet local needs, but to give us some options to market a product that we can say was born, raised, and processed in Wyoming. And I think that's one way to give us some not only opportunity to do some direct marketing to consumers, but also some level of greater competitiveness in the marketplace.
With that being said, you speak of marketing. What are your thoughts on mandatory country of origin labeling?
Personally, and by policy of our organization, we do not support MCOOL. We support country of origin labeling. We think it has a place, but we think it ought to be an industry-driven process, not a government-mandated process. We have encouraged all segments of the industry and through our organizations to embrace more country of origin labeling. I've not seen clear evidence that it would mean more dollars back to our producers. As a consumer, I would like to be able to know where the product that I pick up in the meat counter has come from. But we don't see clear evidence that there's more revenue from having country of origin labeling.
Earlier this spring, President Trump made the comment that he would like to terminate trade deals where we import cattle. What are your thoughts on beef and cattle imports?
Well, first of all, just reacting to the president, he's the same president who recently negotiated the USMCA, which clearly maintains adequate opportunity for us to move and import and export live cattle from our two neighboring nations. So his statement there, I think, was more a play to the circumstance of the time than it was necessarily a policy statement, in my view. a healthy industry for us is dependent on the ability to trade animals and product back and forth among the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Now, as to imports from other countries, I think we need to be very cautious, both from obviously an animal health and food safety perspective, but also from a market protection perspective. So there are some products that we believe we need to import. We believe that we need to have the ability to import a certain amount of lean trim, for example, to meet our hamburger market so that we're not grinding up more valuable cuts of U.S. beef in order to meet market demand.
Our 4 big beef processors are currently under investigation by the DOJ. Do you have any thoughts on this investigation?
Well, we were one of the early groups that wrote a letter to Secretary Barr encouraging the investigation. We worked with our congressional delegation and our governor and our attorney general to get all of those entities weighing in favor of an investigation. So I think what we've seen through the pandemic and what we had seen previously somewhat with the Holcomb fire clearly point the need for an investigation. Having said that, until that is completed, I'm not ready to say that there were illegal activities taking place, and that's what an investigation is going to look at, not whether they played fair, but whether they broke the law. And I hope that we can get some termination of that. If there were laws that were broken, that there's appropriate and timely follow-up and prosecutions. If there weren't, that we can move on beyond that. But the last thing I want to see is that we're just held off for a long period of time under the guise that it's an investigation that's ongoing.
We have seen vertical integration in our other protein industries, such as the hog and poultry industry. Do you think the cattle industry is in danger of going down that same path?
I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely. The difference being in the animal itself, that with hogs and poultry, it's kind of a one-step process to raising an animal and breeding, raising an animal, and going to slaughter with it. With beef, it's a multi-step process and a longer process in terms of length. And I think that it works in our favor that makes it of less interest to processors to establish that level of vertical control.
You are clearly well versed when it comes to the sheep industry and recent issues within the sheep industry. Where are we at right now with the Mountain States Rosen Lamb Processing Plant in Greeley, Colorado? That was obviously purchased by JBS, and there were questions raised about that purchase, and the DOJ stepped in. Where are we at with that whole situation?
Ownership of the plant was shut down. Ownership was transferred to JBS,
Okay.
and that was under an order from the bankruptcy judge here in Wyoming. What we were able to accomplish with DOJ is to then place a 30-day hold on JBS stepping in and making any changes in the plant, because JBS had made it clear that they weren't going to operate it as a lamb plant. They were converted to a processing plant for beef to absorb part of the processing load from their beef facility, which is right across the road from it. And so we have a 30-day hold on that in order to enable justice to look and determine if there were any inappropriate activities took place. And the transfer, I believe, took place on the 7th of July, and the hold was shortly thereafter. So we're coming up on the 30 days relatively soon here, after which, unless justice takes any action, as I understand, after which JBS will be free to go in and initiate their modifications.
If that does occur, as you just said, JBS will take possession of the plant and go in and do their modifications, and that plant won't be available to the sheep industry anymore. How will that affect the sheep industry?
The short-term effect for this year, I think, is severe. We have people in Wyoming and elsewhere who've had finished lambs and no place to go with them. Now, there were a combination of factors. Some of that was occurring before the closure of the plant, simply because so much of the consumer market for lamb is not in retail, but in food service. And when all the restaurants shut down this spring, and particularly over the Easter holiday, which is a very high consumption period for lamb, that left a lot of lamb in freezers all over, and orders were being canceled from the processors, and that's part of what caused the problem for the plant in Greeley, was that buyers were canceling their orders because of the food service industry. So That's created a real backlog that exists yet today. Longer term, I'm somewhat more optimistic. There is a new plant opening in Colorado this fall that is being built by some lamb producers and feeders, so it will be controlled by people in our industry. It won't have the capacity that is equal to the one that was closed, but it'll be a significant portion of that. The other major lamb processor, Superior, has announced that they're able to pick up some additional capacity. And then just this last week, I learned that there's a lamb plant in, I believe it's San Angelo, Texas, that has been shuttered for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's going to reopen. So I think we have the ability to pick up that capacity. The thing that, at least short term, it's a kind of a monopoly market because the only really large processor left is Superior. They have a plant in Colorado and a plant in California.
At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that there at Wyoming Stock Growers, you deal with a lot of natural resource issues that your producers face there in the state. What are some of those issues that producers are facing there in Wyoming?
Most of them are national in scope. We were very heavily dependent, the western two-thirds of the state, on public land grazing, both BLM and Forest Service, and so consistently have had issues with grazing on public lands that we deal with a lot. And probably the second major one would be Endangered Species Act issues, ranging from grizzly bears and wolves down to small species like the Preble's meadow jumping mouse in southeastern Wyoming. And I would highlight particularly those two areas. And the thing that's made it so challenging is that, we've always had some of those issues, and they change by administrations. The current administration has been very friendly to us on most of those issues and has made some meaningful changes. But every one of those changes, as they're promulgated, has led to litigation by the environmental community. So one of the amazing things is when I came to Stock Growers 22 years ago, I was only aware of maybe twice in the 130-year history of the organization that they had ever been involved in litigation. Now it's not unusual that we're involved in 4 or 5 cases at a time in the natural resource arena, and often defending not against the agencies, but defending the agencies and what they've done against the radical environmental community.
What are some of the main concerns you're hearing from your members as we face tough cattle markets?
As far as the market itself, it's been interesting because I think we've seen a turnaround in the past 45 days or so that is much stronger than what most people anticipated. I mean, it was such a disaster in March, April, May, even into June, that our people, most of whom are marketing in the fall, the heavy marketing here, were desperate. As it's turned around, particularly the market for feeder cattle and calves have gained some strength. It's been interesting. We just did our convention last week, and I talked with producers who said, well, I did almost as well as last year, and I talked with a few who said, well, I did better than last year. Not that last year was a great year either, but at least in terms of the huge pressure that we were facing 3 months ago, I think there's some comfort level that that's kind of turned around, and we still know we need to do some things to address some of the issues you and I were talking about earlier in the conversation. But I think we're now able to look at some of those issues like transparency and new market opportunities from a position of strength rather than from a position of desperation.